Most people never question the document they were given at birth. A simple piece of paper stamped and filed, declaring their entry into the world. Official, necessary, universal. But what if that document wasn't just recording your birth? What if it was erasing something else, something older? Something they needed you to forget. The birth certificate system, as we know, it didn't exist before the mid-1800s. Not in its current form. Not as a mandatory government-issued proof of existence. And the timing of when it became mandatory, where it became mandatory, and what it replaced tells a story that official history prefers not to examine. Before 1850, identity worked differently. Bloodline records were kept by families, churches, and local communities. Lineage was documented through baptismal records, family Bibles, estate documents, and oral tradition. Your ancestry wasn't just a name on a government database. It was a living connection to generations of heritage, culture, and in many cases, land rights that stretched back centuries. Then something changed. Between 1850 and 1900, nation after nation implemented mandatory birth registration systems. The official explanation frames this as progress, as modernization, as bureaucratic efficiency, better record keeping, public health tracking, legal identity verification, all reasonable, all practical, all necessary for a functioning industrial society. But here is what they don't mention. The birth certificate system didn't just record births. It standardized identity. It severed the connection between individuals and their ancestral heritage. And it did so during the exact period when Tartarian references were vanishing from maps, when architectural inheritances were being reattributed, when enormous populations seemed to disappear without documented transition. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore once you start looking at the details. In the 1700s, if you wanted to prove who you were, you referenced your lineage. You were the son of this family, descended from that bloodline, connected to these ancestral lands. Your identity was embedded in a web of historical continuity that could be traced back generations, sometimes centuries. By 1900, identity had been reduced to a single government-issued document, no lineage. No ancestral connection, just a name, a date, a location, and a registration number. The transformation was total, and it happened in a single generation. Let's examine what actually changed during this transition. Before the standardized system, birth records existed, but they were kept locally, and they told a different kind of story. Church baptismal records didn't just note a name. They recorded family lineage, godparents who were often relatives, connections to local estates, and sometimes notes about the family's historical standing in the community. These records established more than legal identity. They established heritage. They created a documented link between an individual and a specific ancestral line that often connected to land ownership, trade privileges, or membership in craft guilds. In many European and Asian communities, these records could prove connection to bloodlines that predated the current political structures by centuries. Then the mandatory government registration systems arrived. The records became standardized. The information captured became limited. Name, date, location, parents' names. Nothing about ancestral lineage. Nothing about family heritage. Nothing about connection to previous generations beyond the immediate parents. The depth of historical continuity was flattened into bureaucratic efficiency. And here's the critical detail that most people miss. This didn't happen randomly. It happened systematically, country by country, almost as if following a coordinated pattern. England formalized mandatory civil registration in 1837. France had established it earlier during the Revolutionary period. The United States implemented state systems starting primarily in the 1850s through 1900s. Russia, following its territorial expansion into former Tartarian lands, implemented standardized registration systems in the late 1800s. The timing aligns almost perfectly with the disappearance of Tartaria from cartographic records. The same decades when massive architectural inheritances were being reattributed. The same period when giant skeletons stopped being reported in newspapers. The same transition era when the maps were redrawn and encyclopedias were rewritten. This raises a simple but critical question. Why would multiple nations, many of them rivals or competitors, all implement virtually identical birth registration systems during the same narrow time window? The official answer points to shared modernization, to the spread of bureaucratic efficiency, to independent nations, all arriving at the same administrative solution simultaneously. But that explanation requires us to believe in remarkable coincidence. It requires us to accept that competing empires all decided to standardize identity documentation in the same way, at the same time using systems that all had the same effect of severing connections to deep ancestral lineage. What if the birth certificate system wasn't just about recording births? What if it was about controlling heritage, about ensuring that the next generation would have no documented connection to whatever came before the reset? Consider what happens when you erase ancestral records and replace them with standardized government documents. The new generation grows up with no legal proof of connection to historical bloodlines, no documented claim to ancestral lands, no verifiable link to families that might have held positions, privileges, or knowledge in a previous social order. Within 2 generations, the living memory fades. The stories become folklore. The connections become unprovable. And the official narrative becomes the only narrative because it is the only one supported by legal documentation. The birth certificate doesn't just record a birth. It creates a new starting point. It says, your documented existence begins here, with this government-issued paper. Whatever came before, whatever your family was, whatever they knew, whatever they had, none of that matters because we didn't document it. Let's look at what was actually lost in this transition. In pre-standardization Europe, many families maintained detailed lineage records that could prove descent from specific bloodlines going back to the medieval period or earlier. These weren't just records for nobility. Merchant families, craft guild families, even some agricultural families kept records that established their historical presence in a region and their connection to specific trades or lands. These records had legal weight. They could be used to claim inheritance rights, to prove membership in trade organizations, to establish residence rights in cities that restricted immigration. They were more than historical curiosities. They were functional legal documents that connected individuals to a past that granted them specific rights and privileges. The standardized birth certificate eliminated all of that. The new system recognized only the immediate family unit. Parents and child, no grandparents, no extended lineage, no connection to ancestral trades or lands, just a nuclear family existing in bureaucratic isolation, with no legally recognized connection to anything that came before. And here's where it gets even more troubling. In many regions, the transition to the new system was accompanied by the deliberate destruction or neglect of the old records. Church records that had been carefully maintained for centuries were suddenly declared outdated, unnecessary, no longer legally relevant. Some were archived in ways that made them difficult to access. Others were simply lost during convenient fires or institutional reorganizations. The pattern repeats across Europe, across North America, across regions where Tartarian influence had been strongest. The old records vanished just as the new standardized system was being implemented. This wasn't just modernization. This was systematic erasure of the paper trail that connected living populations to their actual heritage. Now, let's talk about what this means for Tartarian ancestry specific. If Tartaria existed as the maps suggest, if it was a civilization spanning vast territories with established governmental structures and cultural institutions, then its population would have had documented lineages, families with recorded histories, bloodlines with legal standing. When Tartaria disappeared from maps, when its territories were reattributed to expanding empires, what happened to those family records? What happened to the documentation that proved these people belonged to a specific heritage, a specific culture, a specific historical continuity? The evidence suggests those records were systematically replaced, not destroyed outright, which would be too obvious, but superseded by a new system that simply didn't capture the same information. The birth certificates that replaced the old lineage records didn't ask about Tartarian heritage, didn't document connection to Tartarian bloodlines, didn't recognize any ancestral claim that predated the new political order. Within a generation, the legal proof of Tartarian ancestry simply ceased to exist. The families remained, the people remained, but their documented connection to a Tartarian past was severed by administrative redesign. This is how you erase a civilization without mass violence. You don't need to eliminate the population. You just need to eliminate their legal connection to their own past. You implement a new documentation system that doesn't recognize the old claims. You wait for the generation with living memory to die, and then the erasure is complete. The architectural evidence remains. The oversized buildings still stand. The impossible construction techniques are still visible. But the people who might have had a legal claim to Tartarian heritage, who might have inherited knowledge or property or status from that civilization, they no longer have documents that prove the connection. Their birth certificates start fresh. Year zero of their documented existence. Everything before that is prehistory, legally unverifiable, easily dismissed as family mythology. Let me show you how thorough this system was. When birth registration became mandatory in various nations, it wasn't just about creating new records going forward. In many cases, there were active efforts to register existing populations retroactively to bring everyone into the new system. People who had lived their entire lives with identity established through church records, family Bibles, and community recognition were suddenly required to obtain government-issued birth certificates. And when those certificates were issued, they captured only the standardized information: name, date, place. Nothing about the family's ancestral heritage, nothing about their connection to pre-existing social structures, for families that might have had Tartarian ancestry. This was the final severing. Even if they knew their heritage, even if they maintained oral traditions about their ancestral origins, the legal documentation now said something different. It said they were subjects or citizens of the new political order, with no legally recognized connection to anything that came before. And here is the detail that makes this even more suspect: the standardization of names. Many regions that implemented birth certificate systems also implemented standardized spelling of names. Family names that had been spelled multiple ways, that had historical variations reflecting regional dialects or linguistic evolution, were suddenly locked into a single official spelling. This might seem like simple efficiency, but it had a deeper effect. It severed the etymological connection between family names and their historical origins. A name that might have clearly indicated Tartarian linguistic roots when spelled in its original form became obscured when forced into the spelling conventions of the new political order. The Russification of names and territories absorbed into the Russian Empire. The Anglicization of names in British colonial territories. The standardization of names in American immigration records, the pattern repeats. The official explanation is always administrative efficiency, but the effect is always the same. The linguistic heritage embedded in family names is obscured or erased entirely. Within 2 generations, families no longer know what their own names originally meant or what heritage they indicated. The birth certificate says, "This is your name now. Spell it this way," and the connection to the past is lost. Now consider this in the context of property rights. Before the standardized systems, proving ownership of land often required proving ancestral connection to that land. Family records showing generations of occupation or use. church records documenting baptisms and deaths in a specific location over centuries, estate documents passing property through bloodlines. This created a legal framework where displacement of populations required either outright conquest or negotiated settlement. You couldn't simply claim empty land if there were families with documented ancestral claims to it. But what happens when you implement a new documentation system that doesn't recognize those old claims? What happens when the birth certificate becomes the primary proof of identity, and it contains no information about ancestral land rights? Suddenly, claims to property that had been inherited through generations become unprovable. The new system asks for title deeds, for registration in government land offices, for documentation that conforms to the new bureaucratic standards. The old family records, the ancestral claims, they're not recognized anymore. This is how you inherit cities you didn't build. This is how you claim vast territories without documented conquest. You don't take the land by force. You take it by administrative redesign. You implement a new documentation system, wait for the old one to become legally irrelevant, and then you own everything because you are the only one with recognized proof of ownership under the new system. The birth certificate was part of that redesign. It created a population with no legally recognized claims to anything that predated the new political order. No claims to land, no claims to heritage, no claims to knowledge or status inherited from Tartarian ancestors. And the most disturbing part, most people never questioned it because it seemed so obviously beneficial. Of course we need standardized record keeping. Of course we need government-issued identity documents. Of course we need efficient bureaucratic systems. But efficiency always comes at a cost, and the cost of this particular efficiency was the severing of legal connection to ancestral heritage for entire populations. What knowledge was lost in that transition? What understanding of Tartarian technology, of advanced construction techniques, of free energy systems or harmonic architecture might have been passed down through family lineages if those lineages had remained legally recognized and socially valued? Instead, the birth certificate system created legal orphans, people with no documented connection to their deep past, people who might carry Tartarian bloodlines but have no way to prove it, people whose ancestors might have been engineers, guardians, or operators of the old world infrastructure, but whose birth certificates say they're just citizens, subjects, members of a new order with no claims to the knowledge of the old. The buildings remain. The technology remains dormant and misunderstood, and we remain walking through inherited cities with documents that tell us we have no legal connection to the people who built them. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Every mechanism of the reset, whether the mudflood itself, the rewriting of maps, the suppression of giant discoveries, they all share a common feature. They sever connection to the past. They create discontinuity. They make it impossible to prove what came before. And the birth certificate system was perhaps the most elegant mechanism of all, because it didn't destroy anything. It didn't need to. It simply failed to document the things that mattered most. It created a new kind of record that looked comprehensive, but actually captured almost nothing about ancestral heritage, historical continuity, or connection to pre-reset civilization. So what does this mean for anyone researching their own ancestry today? It means the paper trail goes cold remarkably quickly. You can trace your family back to the implementation of the birth certificate system in your region. Maybe you can find church records that go back another generation or two. But then you hit a wall. The records become sparse. The documentation becomes inconsistent. The connections become unprovable, and you are left wondering who your ancestors really were, what they knew, what they built, what heritage they carried that the birth certificate system never bothered to record. This isn't accidental. This is the system working exactly as designed, severing your legal claim to Tartarian ancestry, making it impossible to prove connection to the old world, ensuring that within a few generations, The living memory fades and the architectural inheritance can be claimed by whoever controls the new documentation systems. The buildings remember even if the birth certificates don't. The architecture carries the truth. The oversized proportions, the sophisticated engineering, the global coordination, all of it points to something that existed before, something that built at scales we still can't replicate. But your legal connection to that heritage, your birth certificate doesn't mention it. And what the birth certificate doesn't mention, officially doesn't exist.